Before I begin, a quick housekeeping note. We'll get on with this. This session is on the record. It's being live streamed on our website. And for those of you on Twitter, feel free to follow along using hashtag #ACForum. I must say we've done some baton passing of chairs during my time at the Atlantic Council. It's always one of my favorite times. And we very often turn it into something like this, a town hall, where I'll ask a couple of questions, but I really want you to ask questions of our chairman, General Jim Jones, and then since yesterday, our chairman-elect, John Rogers. So it's my pleasure to host this session with two individuals who have been and will be central in shaping the role that the Atlantic Council plays, actually our country plays on the global stage, and the Atlantic Council as well. We had a board dinner last night at the Japanese residence, and we will have a video of the event that we hope to provide people as well. But it was really looking at Jim Jones' amazing life of public service. And actually, even before the public service, going back to his childhood in Paris, where I didn't know that French was actually his first language in the French school, and then going all the way through National Security Advisor, Marine Commandant, Supreme Allied Commander, Europe. And it was really a rich conversation. He's the only person to have served twice as chairman of the board of the Atlantic Council. The other person who's done that, General Scowcroft. And there's a lot of commonality in how with what integrity, bipartisan purpose, they've led their lives. It's indeed, and it's my incredible pleasure to have his successor, John F.W. Rogers, here. Just yesterday, the Executive Committee approved with a unanimous vote John's election as chairman of the Atlantic Council beginning January 1st, 2019. So first of all, please join me in applauding General Jones' service and John Rogers' future service. Congratulations. I'm the luckiest person in the world to work with a board like we have and to work with chairs of the sort we've had. We've done passing of the baton involving Secretary Chuck Hagel, Governor John Huntsman, General Scowcroft himself, and of course General Jones. First of all, on John Rogers, he's currently serving as Executive Vice President of Goldman Sachs, and is the firm's Chief of Staff and Secretary of the Board of the Directors. He's got a wealth of experience. He's really one of these hybrid people who knows the private sector and the global economy intimately, but also loves and understands our issues from his time in government. He's been in the public and private sector, including being a key figure in management in the executive branch, leader in the financial services industry, and as a trustee or chairman of some of the nation's most important nonprofit institutions. And as you can imagine, that's very important for us as well. His passion, I think the search committee found that his passion for the United States international leadership role and commitment to a bipartisan approach embodies the Atlantic Council's purpose and mission. But beyond that, we had great conversations from his understanding of global financial and political landscapes. And John, we also had a really rich conversation just passed with Admiral Rogers and Senator Warner, also on the geotechnological issues that you and I have talked about. Many of you already know him well and are familiar with John's career as Undersecretary of State for Management and the U.S. Department of State, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, and Assistant to the President of the United States. He takes the helm from someone who's left an indelible mark, not only the Atlantic Council, but also our country. So with a current and future chairman of the Atlantic Council with me here on stage, it's a good opportunity, and I'll ask them one or two questions about the global situation, one or two questions about how they see the Atlantic Council's role in this situation, and then I'm going to try to open up, because our time is short, so I'm going to try to open up as quickly as I can to all of you as well for your questions. So, General Jones, I wonder if you can pick up on conversation we've had in the past, and what we had in a private setting that a lot of people here weren't at, as it was a board dinner last night, on the what keeps you up at night question. And this picks up nicely following off of Admiral Rogers and Senator Warner. As you're looking to the future, what trends do you see as favoring the United States, and what things do you see that give you some concern?
Well, thank you very much, Fred. And John, may I just start by congratulating you and welcoming you aboard officially. You're going to be a great leader for this organization, and we're delighted to have you.
Thank you, General.
Thank you. So I would start out by saying that I think one of the things that we don't think about enough in our country, in the public sector, is the historical fact that great nations, empires, all have a beginning and an end. And that's not, there's no exception to that as it applies to the United States. If you want to talk about the 20th century as being the American century, I think there's good reason to believe that. But I also think there's a kind of naive belief in our country that there's some sort of destiny that the primacy of the United States is ensured for some reason forever. And I don't think that's the case. And I think whereas we reacted to 2 world wars, Korea, and a number of 20th century issues, the race to the moon, the fall of the Soviet Empire, all of that came in really the last 50 years of the century. But the question really is that we should be concerned about is what's the 21st century? What's the destiny of the 21st century? And most organizations, whether you're a country or a company, you rise and fall based on your ability to change when the environment around you changes. And if you cannot change, your domain will fall. You will fail. And I think that one of the things that we need to really understand is that we can fail. There is nothing that's in writing that says that at the end of the 21st century, the United States will be as influential on the global playing field as we were at the end of the 20th century. And that's something that I think that people need to wake up to. And frankly, on the panels that I heard this morning, that was the underlying theme. We have to change, we have to evolve. We have to understand that conflict is not necessarily, and disagreements are not necessarily going to be resolved by armed forces in the future. And frankly, the challenges that we face is not about military superiority so much, although there's challenges to that, but it's about the environment that has changed and the environment that we have to compete in. And so, for the United States, being at the vanguard of global and economic, political and social freedom and human rights, it still stands out to me as being something that's extremely important. That we should lead in promoting security, stability, and development. We should lead in our economic, we should be the standard setter in our economic policies and commercial policies. And we should absolutely retain the lead in innovation in goods and services and solutions to human needs. And it is absolutely essential that we lead in technological development and innovation. And I think that one in particular is extremely important. And we live in a world where we are facing rising autocracies, whether you've noticed it or not. The democracies are either being changed or challenged, but our principal challenges are coming from autocracies. And autocracies, some of them are not backwater autocracies, they're front-of-the-line autocracies like China is, and able and willing and capable of challenging us and our primacy in the century. And so the lead in advocating for proactive and international engagement to prevent all kinds of predictable disasters, and Alan Tauscher mentioned this, to being more proactive so as to prevent future catastrophes is really something that we should embrace. But in order to do that, the institutions that we created in the 20th century to deal with 20th century realities have to change so they can respond to 21st century challenges. And by that I mean being much more flexible, being proactive, being preemptive in our policies. And this doesn't have to be the U.S. role by itself. It has to be an international role of like-minded countries. And we have to create a set of international norms that shows that whether it's cybersecurity intrusions, as was mentioned by the last panel, there are consequences. There are standards, there are norms, there are agreements that if you don't follow them, and if you're not going to be a player, a full-time player by the rules, there are consequences. And in my judgment, appeasement of these competing autocracies is not the way to go. They don't understand appeasement. If you give in on one thing, they'll take another. They'll take the next step. So what keeps me up at night is that naive belief that we can continue to be what we think we've always been, at least those of us who've been alive in the 20th and 21st century, without competing and without doing the things that we have to do to change from within. And that really means a much more broad-minded focus of who we are, where we want to go, and what the pathway is to get there. And probably on the technology level, nothing in my mind is more important than where we're headed in artificial intelligence, 5G, and those kinds of technologies. And the competition is fierce, it's real, and we could lose this race. Sorry for the long answer.
It's a great answer. John, I wonder, same question, but with a little bit different of a tilt. As you've spent so much of your time after leaving government looking at global economic affairs, and you and I have talked a little bit about the competitive nature of the world, and as General Jones said, it's not just military and security, it's locked up in all sorts of economic, innovative, and competitive issues as well. So if you're looking at our challenges going forward, where do you see enormous opportunity for us? And the same question, what keeps you up late at night?
Yeah, thank you. But if you'll just indulge me for a minute, but let me just say to all my colleagues now here that how excited I am to be here and to be part of you. When I was very young and working for President Reagan, one day I got a call and to go to the Oval Office, and there I got the Presidential Citizens Medal, and I was in my 20s, and I said to the president, how is it possible that a young man in his 20s could ever be worthy of a designation of a citizenship, having not fulfilled my life? And I find that I'm in the same place here today with General Jones, because how is it possible that I could live up to the expectations given his leadership? My dad always said, never follow in the footsteps of a great man, you'll be lost inside his shoes. And here I am ignoring it, his advice, and following behind the general. So Our country owes him a great deal of gratitude. This institution owes him a tremendous degree of gratitude because it's the second round for him to help this organization. But I'm just gratified that I'm in the position of having secured from him a commitment that he would help me. And so, you know, as I look at these small little shoes, I'm gratified that I'll have some help along the way. So thank you for that.
Locals.
When I look at the world in which we live, and General and I had this opportunity to have a long discussion about this, my road was formed in the Cold War. And at the same time, I was there when it ended. And I was there as the architecture that was put in place to lead us forward. I went and got engaged in finance on the belief that the world would no longer be solely political military and that it would be shaped more in economics. And I think that my theory seemed to be worked for all the years right up till 9/11. And then 9/11 reminded that the height of the new economy, as it was called at that time, was not going to protect you from falling concrete. And that the nation state is the only instrument by which, only organizational concept that can provide for that common defense and for that protection. So I've now evolved into the fact of those realities and find that I'm in a hybrid of still believing strongly in the economic underpinnings of national security, and as I've traveled in the world, also seeing the degree of which that evolution, not only in terms of services and products, is having a dramatic effect and at incredible speeds. We just talked about cyber issues. In some ways, they're a companion to exactly these developments that are taking place. And so I find that you can't divide anymore into the very neat organizational structure of just economic, just political, just military, and that the blending is quite pronounced. And the complications in this world are just much more immense in trying to navigate it. And for the United States, I find that it can't do it alone. It has to do it in concert with others, and it has to be a leader in evolving the institutions that are going to be able to deal with the things the General was just talking about. So to me, I think the unique aspect of the Atlantic Council is the ability to foster the development of those new institutions, to refine some of the ones that have existed. We've talked about this because ones he's led in terms of NATO. What is the realities of that in this changing world, and what are the capacities that need to be added on or bolted on in order for us to be successful? But I know, as I've navigated in the world and the countries over the last 25 years in which I've done business, that's impossible to do without this union. So I feel I'm committed to that, and I also feel that it's an essential part.
Thank you for that. So let me ask one more question of each of you and then turn right to the audience. And this will be about the Atlantic Council. We've spent a lot of time over the last 18 months talking about our strategy, and both of you know it very well. But for those in the audience, we settled on 5 big bets. We felt that this was a defining moment in history, maybe as important as 1919, 1945, 1989. We can only hope it's not as important as 1914 and 1939. And then we started thinking about what is it that really set this time apart. And we pointed to 5 issues and then took on a 6th. And one of them was the return of major power, potential return of major power conflict, certainly heightened major power competition. The second was fraying democracies, surging autocracies, which General Jones, Jim Jones talked about. The third was questions about the future of the U.S. role in the world. Fourth is future of the global system that was created in no small part by the founders of the Atlantic Council. And the fifth was the disruptive technologies you heard about in the last panel and how it will inform all of that. And then we took on a sixth, and that was how do we actually help train, mentor, bring along the next generation of leader to take on this volatile world. That's a lot for an organization. As much as we've grown, we're still not massive. We're still not with our tentacles everywhere in the world. It's a lot to take on, and we do it through networks. We do it through active measures of our work, more toward do tank than think tank. But talk to me a little bit, and maybe I'll start with you, John. You have 100 different places you could go in this world, yet you've talked some about why the Atlantic Council. And so maybe talk a little bit about that, but also in this very challenging situation, what kind of role you think we ought to be playing. And then I'll turn the same question to our chairman, Jim Jones.
Well, let me start with when I came to Washington in 1974, I read a book, Washington Now, that was written by Knight Kiplinger, my friend, and his father wrote this book, produced this wonderful newsletter, investor newsletter that I sort of grew up with. But he made these observations at the time, and I'll never forget it because he said about Washington, in essence, in our government, he said, Washington is neither as good as some wish it to be, nor as bad as many believe it to be. It could be better, and it probably will be. It could be worse, and there will be times when it is. Good, bad, in between. Washington affects what you do and what you may not do. And I've thought about that always in my work, either when I was in government or not in government. And as it relates to the Atlantic Council, it's part of that also establishment and defining what Washington is. So I think it's a catalyst to help it be as good as we want it to be and better than maybe it is. And that is by providing an insight into what's happening in the world, to provide in a very entrepreneurial form the necessary research and work, and also the sponsorship of dialogue that can help improve those interactions. We, after the end of the war, the Second World War, we built institutions. Those institutions created an order, and we operated under that order. And we find ourselves today with some of those institutions not being capable of meeting some of the demands, some of them being ignored, but the basic principles still exist, which is, you know, in the words of one of my colleagues in the State Department, Bob Zelig, you know, you have to work block upon block, and you welcome luck, but you never depend on it. And I think that we are part of that process of building block upon block. And I think that's where I see this role. And that's why it's so exciting, because the opportunity set is pretty wide, just based on what General Jones said at the outset of his remarks in this world and how it is changing so dramatically right in front of us. I think about China as an example. I've been to China so many times in my career, and we operated on a premise with China that basically said we would move through a series of reforms and interactions, and in time we would move to these different institutions that we would understand, meaning democratic institutions. The country would change. Well, that didn't really end up happening. And what happened is we ended up with a hybrid, and a very much a state-controlled hybrid. So I think today we have to let go of what from 1978 forward by multiple administrations was an approach to a reality that the state-controlled hybrid is going to exist, and therefore how do we interact with it? How do we look for those common things that we can advance together, but at the same time be direct about those things which are not that good and are not actually the way we wish to engage on an international basis.
Thank you, John. Jim.
So I think the Atlantic, when I think of the Atlantic Council, I think of the last decade and where the council itself actually changed to meet the environment that we were operating in. I mean, that's really what accounts for, I think, the success of the Atlantic Council over the last decade. We looked at the environment. We saw that the Cold War was over. The Atlantic Council was essentially viable during those days. But once the Cold War ended, and before recent Russian behavior restarted, we decided that the Atlantic touches all other bodies of water in the planet, and we created geostrategic centers to respond to that new environment. We created functional areas that also responded to the new environment. And I think the other thing that we've done extremely well, which was sorely lacking, I think, in terms of government's ability to do this, is think strategically. And I think for the future, it's a strategic emphasis that is going to keep the Atlantic Council viable, because we produce quality work that's strategic and it's of use to governments. The other quality that I think is really important for the Atlantic Council is the international participation of our members. This is, in a way, the way the United States, I think, should reach out to other countries by being inclusive, by being respectful, by listening to other ideas, by learning from other people, by looking at the same problem from different viewpoints from different capitals around the world. And I think we've got a good path forward, but we should never be reluctant to change when the environment changes, and the environment will change, and we just have to stay up with that challenge.
I think that's underscored at changing with the environment, and if you look at our 12 programs and centers and the amazing intellectual entrepreneurs who lead them all,
I mean, if I could,
a lot of range to do that.
If I could, just to mention two as an example. One is the 3 Cs initiative, and the other one is the idea of forming a geotech center, which would be a strategic center that would analyze the impact of technology on geostrategic issues. That's not out there in other think tanks right now. That's a corner of the market that somebody needs to capture, and I hope it's at the Atlantic Council.
Thank you very much. We only have about 10 minutes, 8 to 10 minutes, but let me pick up a couple of questions, comments. Peter Ackerman, a member of the executive committee of our board.
Welcome, John. And the argument that we have to be able to change is hallmark American, and it's right on, and it's always the safest course. But we might also think about China right now a little bit like the Soviet Union was in the late 60s, where they were at the pinnacle of their growth rates. And that actually might be happening right now in China, because there's definitely a negative correlation between levels of repression and levels of growth rate. And if you look right now and see what's happening in China, is that more and more assets are being forced into the government institutions whose productivity is going through the floor. So if that's the case, one of the things that's going to keep us where we want to be is to advocate amongst our allies the policies that maximize our growth rates and differentiates our growth rates economically from who our potential adversaries are. And so I'd just like you to maybe think about that and reflect on that idea for a moment.
So let me turn to both John and Jim to answer that. And let me lay on that the contrary argument is that in a big data-driven, AI-driven world, where a state and a state actor can make quick decisions of a sort that seem to be increasingly difficult for democracies to make, that there's also some built-in, perhaps some new built-in advantages for autocracies. So,
well, maybe I'll come at it this way. China is, pursuing policies that have to do with the ability of managing its population and what it has. It's the commodity richest nation in the world, but it's missing 5 commodities: oil, iron ore, copper, cotton, and soybeans. Cotton and soybeans by national policy more than scarcity, but all part of a strategy. So when you look and see what's happening in the world, it's part of a strategy to secure a flow of those resources to the country. I don't see, General, it as being an extension of a political hegemony. I see it as being an extension of an economic. And it needs to do that because its systems have a series of defects, and it carries with it some very interesting dynamics. One that's rarely talked about is the enormous debt that's being carried forward, particularly at the municipal level. I actually think this is a very, very important development, and it goes to the heart of what they're most concerned about, or seem to be, which is stability. At the same time, they are an emerging economy that is reaching a certain point that it believes it can do certain things. It's created institutions. So, for example, it's created the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank. It has a Belt and Road initiatives that further that the activity of that I spoke at the outset. And we see for the first time them operating in places in a world that was more often left to the United States in its position and its economy. So I look at this and think that you have to respond institutionally to where it is. So I was very happy to see that the United States finally responded to an investment vehicle by taking the Overseas Private Investment Corporation and basically creating this new structure and doubling the size of an investment capabilities that it had to meet obligations, and as an extraordinarily important extension of our foreign policy. So if I look at that model, I try to think about it on a purely economic basis of what we have to do ourselves. That leads to what I think this institution can do by thinking very clearly about the business and the economic aspects of what's going on and how to facilitate an understanding of that. But as the general reminded me about, as a byproduct, there's also an increase in its military presence, its near China desire to be dominant, and a very very interesting investment into its military. And as I'm always reminded by many people that things go bump in the night. So you have to be concerned about the aspects of that as well. But I think the approach here is very much an economic one, and at the core of it, I still think is their primary objective stability. They've learned all the lessons associated with the Soviet Union. They know exactly what happened, and as a governmental structure, I think they're determined not to allow those things to happen, and what they would perceive as chaos, I think.
Thank you. General Jones, I think this is going to have to be our final answer of this group. So to Peter's question, and it sort of underscores what I've been thinking about is should the world's concern more be around a China that's too successful, or a China that hits a crisis period which could prompt it to act out maybe even more in a nationalist direction toward Taiwan or other issues. But you can answer that or any other question you'd like to answer.
No, I mean, I think I think the autocracies, particularly China, Russia, Iran, maybe North Korea, but certainly some others, and then the sweeping change is going on in the African continent of rulers not stepping down when their term is over, just ignoring the constitution that they've created themselves, like in the DRC, for example. These are real threats because these autocracies have, as John just pointed out, have learned in the 20th century how to avoid the pitfalls of internal demise. And so I think the bloom's off the rose about Vladimir Putin, for example. I think we know who he is, what he thinks, and how he's going to be for the foreseeable future. Doesn't mean that we can't keep trying, but we have to be realistic. I think in China, China's really the big long-term competitor that we face. I think there's a lot of things that are going to go on inside of China that are going to cause the Communist Party some difficulties. For instance, every time that there's an emerging middle class in history in any country, they veer towards democracy because the middle class demands more voice and more say. So there are things we shouldn't just sit back and say, China is inevitably going to be successful. I don't buy that. But I think we should be clear-eyed about what they're doing, and I think we should be very positive about the things that we can do. Some of them were discussed this morning and that we should do because it is the policy of appeasement is not a successful policy against an autocracy. So, and I do think it should be an international response. I think we should renew our ties with the EU, understand that that's where our roots are, but although we've expanded globally. But I think there are some fundamental institutions that we need to help reshape for the competitive world that we're in the 21st century. And I mean competitive, not just militarily or politically, I mean in the field of science. If you watch the progress that the Chinese are making in space, we should be thinking about things like that. It's a holistic challenge to our traditional role in the world, and we should do whatever we have to do to respond to it.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that. In many ways, this bilateral challenge, the sort of epical test of our times, has all of the 5 big bets of the Atlantic Council involved in it. Major power competition, future of democracy and autocracy, the future role of the U.S. in the world. What role do we want to play in that region? What role do we want to play in competing with China in the world? Future of the global system. How do we sort that out? And then, as you said at the end, the commanding heights of the technological race, AI, 5G, quantum computing. So for this reason, this is the contest that embodies all of that.
Correct.
So thanks so much for your questions. I see 2 or 3 other people who would like to ask a question, but I'm afraid we have to move on now. Stay in your seats because we're going straight to Dr. Saeed and the introducer, and I'd ask them to already come up as I thank our chairman and our chairman-elect.